Andy Milligan, the writer and director of the subject of today's video, famously said, "Do you come from a happy home? I don't. I really didn't have a pleasant childhood. But you don't turn into an artist if you have a happy home life. I only write about what I know. I just remember the bad things." Putting aside the dubious idea that you have to have a bad family life to be an artist, that's a hell of a statement from somebody who is mostly remembered for producing absolute schlock, the bottom of the B-movie barrel. But when I tell you that one of his most accessible, closest to the mainstream movies is an unsparing diatribe on the injustice of capitalism and the corruption of societal systems, yeah, it's there. Andy Milligan had the sort of life and career that makes Ed Wood look like a Hollywood Pollyanna, and for better or for worse, that life is reflected in so many of his films. His anger, his disappointment, his frustration all feed into movies with titles like Torture Dungeon, The Man with Two Heads, The Rats Are Coming, The Werewolves Are Here, or his 1972 film that was simply entitled Blood, with cult film website Bleeding Skull referring to his cinematic repertoire as a celebration of hate.
You hated him. Now you've killed him.
Hate is a strong word, my dear sister.
You hated him. You killed him.
Born in 1929 in St. Paul, Minnesota, Andrew Jackson Milligan Jr. was the son of a career Army officer. The life of a military brat can feel foundationless, and the Milligans would move around the country for most of young Andy's childhood, following his father from assignment to assignment. His mother was an alcoholic with severe mental health issues, and Andy would later recall that she was violently abusive toward him, his half-brother Harley, his younger sister Louise, and his father, Andy Sr. While Andy grew up feeling very close to his father, shortly after graduating from high school, he would escape from his family life by joining the United States Navy, where he would serve for 4 years, receiving an honorable discharge in 1951. Fresh off the boat, he would decide to call New York City his home, and he would begin a dual career as a stage actor and a dressmaker, opening his own shop. In addition to appearing in plays in New York, he would also appear in the occasional episode of Armstrong Circle Theater and the Kraft Television Theater, which would frequently feature television adaptations of smaller live stage shows. In the late 50s, Milligan would fall in with the Cafe Sino crowd, joining the regulars at the Greenwich Village Coffee House who were staging revolutionary and often stridently political work from Lanford Wilson and John Guare, among others. Sino is often recalled today as the cradle of the Off-Off-Broadway scene, shows that were not only too revolutionary for Broadway, but too much even for off-Broadway houses. Milligan not only performed at the cafe, but also tried his hand at directing classic works by Lord Dunsany and Jean Genet, which would lead to him picking up work directing for Ellen Stewart's La Mama Experimental Theater Club. La Mama was founded by Stewart as a nurturing space for playwrights, and in its early days, while Stewart felt her model for production was very different, the theater would gain many of its productions by offering space to shows that had already been running at Cafe Sino, with cafe owner Joe Sino frequently refusing to extend runs of the shows that were booked in at the cafe. La Mama would be the incubator where popular shows from the cafe stage would be allowed to continue their runs, building a name for the associated playwrights and directors. But beyond the Cafe Sino connection, Stewart may also have felt a kinship with Milligan as a fellow clothing designer, as she subsidized the opening of her own theater with her work as a fashion designer and seamstress. Milligan would frequent La Mama in its early days, working as a director and debuting new plays that he had written himself as well, and taking jobs costuming off-Broadway shows through his clothing boutique, Ad-Lib. I want to take a second here to say that I didn't read a stage direction out loud. The name of his boutique was Ad-Lib. In 1965, Milligan would make his film debut, directing the 32-minute film Vapors.
I've decided I don't like this place at all. It's like a hell for men. An insane asylum for mad homosexuals. I don't belong here. Some of those boys were giggling and whispering about me in the hallway. Whatever possessed you to come then? Oh, I heard so much about the bats. They're famous, you know.
Shot on a handheld 16mm film camera with onboard sound and with a script by Hope Stansbury, the drama takes place inside a bathhouse. The establishing shot was filmed outside of St. Mark's Bathhouse, at the time a popular gay men's meeting spot. But the rest of the movie was filmed on a vacant floor of the apartment building Milligan called home. Initially it played in art house theaters, but 2 years after its debut, it would start screening publicly at the Cameo Cinema as part of an adults-only program. Milligan's films would catch the attention of William Mishkin, a prolific financier of exploitation movies. But while Milligan was quickly becoming a part of the exploitation scene, he always saw himself as being separate from other exploiteers like Herschel Gordon Lewis and Russ Meyer. He reveled in the lack of slick production values on his films, preferring to often work with his handheld Oricon news camera that allowed him to throw his shots into violent motion, such as his signature swirl camera shot, where he would turn the camera rapidly and end the movement, pointing it at the ground. In Milligan's mind, this raw style of filmmaking fit with the rawness of his subject material, and he would insist that he was different from his fellow grindhouse filmmakers because he was the only one with a serious message to his work. It's probably worth mentioning at this point that Milligan was infamously difficult to get along with. He's been quoted as saying, "When I'm working, I'm a monster, and I know that. But it's the only way you can get it done for that money. Low budget means you can't do it again." But the fact is that his irritability extended far beyond his working life. He had a violent temper, and was prone to fly into a rage at a moment's notice, especially with anybody who dared to drink or smoke around him, because Milligan himself was a teetotaler who associated alcohol, drugs, and tobacco with the abuse he had suffered as a child. In the Off-Off-Broadway scene, he was known for firing actors from his productions simply because he had heard that they had gone out drinking after a show. Milligan was married once in 1968 to Candy Hammond, an exotic dancer who had featured in several of his movies. Nobody in Milligan's life, not even Candy herself, took the marriage seriously, as Milligan was openly gay. But even knowing that from the start wouldn't keep the marriage from ending in divorce just 1 year later. Private relationships were just not common in Milligan's life. In fact, only a handful of people ever counted themselves as close friends of Milligan, including Dennis Malvasi, who would work both in front of and behind the camera on several of Andy's movies. Malvasi was a former U.S. Marine who would later be suspected of bombing several abortion clinics in New York, and was convicted of at least one of those bombings, resulting in a 5-year jail sentence. Milligan spent a year living and working in London, where he turned out 5 movies and 5 episodes of a sitcom entitled The Adventures of Red Rooster that would apparently never be broadcast. He returned to New York City in 1970, and his first movie upon arriving back in the United States was Guru, the Mad Monk.
You love her very much, don't you?
With my body, with my soul.
With your body, perhaps, but not your soul. Your soul belongs to God.
I can't believe there is a God and things like this can happen.
Don't ever say that. Don't ever say that in my presence again.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean that.
Of course you didn't.
The majority of The Mad Monk, a medieval period piece, was filmed at St. Peter's Episcopal Church in New York City. And when I say it's one of Milligan's most accessible works, it's because many of his films are filled with shocking scenes of violence, as well as graphic sex scenes. This one avoids the sex scenes, so by comparison, Guru the Mad Monk seems almost tame. But it still bears all the marks of a Milligan film, for good or for ill. The hour-long movie packs in a corrupt and murderous chaplain, a wealthy vampiress, and a grave-robbing jailer. Guru agrees to take in Nadja, whose lover Carl wants to see her saved from execution, but don't think that he does it out of the goodness of his heart. As it turns out, Guru is a very, very bad chaplain, who has bargained to provide Olga the vampire with fresh blood, and who is also seeking every opportunity he can find to squeeze the local populace for more money so that he can buy his way higher up in the church. It's a grubby little story where nobody truly winds up happy. But isn't that always the way when money gets involved?
What's your name?
Christine. What's yours?
Olga. Some call me Neferatu.
Neferatu? I never heard that name before.
Yes, it means soul of darkness.
I like the name of Olga better.
So do I.
The movie was reportedly envisioned by Milligan as a diatribe against his parents' Catholic faith, and given the period in which it is set, that means it pulls in pretty much every other element of society as well. The story is built on a series of backroom deals, briberies, and handshake agreements that all collapse one by one, and in all of it there is only one universal. The person in the agreement who has more power and more money always gets what they want, and they get to escape unharmed. Nobody in the course of the movie deals fairly with the people below them, and yet everybody expects the people above to deal fairly with them. Whether it's a simple peasant dealing with the chaplain, or the chaplain dealing with the Vatican. In Milligan's world, the more power you have, the less you have to honor your side of a bargain.
Not all prisoners are executed. Some of them merely have their eyes put out and their hands and feet cut off.
Surely you at least treat their newly acquired wounds before you ship them out.
Oh, no, we couldn't possibly do that. We couldn't afford to give them free treatment. It's enough for us to be able to give them spiritual food for their souls. No, I'm really quite hungry.
Honestly, it can be hard to argue against that view of the world. Oligarchs can toss their privilege around and feel safe knowing that they have a legion of fanboys just waiting to swarm anybody who dares to criticize them. In modern capitalism, it's not unusual to see more money paid into and influence brought to bear on avoiding obligations under a contract than it would have cost to simply honor the agreement. It's almost like the point of power is always, ultimately, to consolidate more power. And in Milligan's world, only the foolish try to get more power from the more powerful. Instead, you have to learn the complexities of squeezing the less fortunate while avoiding being squeezed by the more fortunate.
We've only arrived moments ago, and already you're giving our young father here a very bad impression of the way we run the business of our Lord. And I distinctly heard you say, my money. Since when is the money of the church your money?
Milligan himself wound up experiencing a lot of being squeezed by those with more money and privilege. In 1985, he closed his theater company, the Troupe Theater, and moved across the continent to Los Angeles in a car containing all of his worldly possessions and driven by Malvasi. In Los Angeles, he picked up a bit of work directing more low-budget B-movies, including the poorly received comedy Surge a Kill, and he attempted to revive his theater company with Troop West. In 1989, he would lose his lover, Bobby Wayne Keaton, to the AIDS epidemic. Milligan was himself diagnosed with HIV just shortly after, but kept his condition concealed while he worked on writing more scripts. With many in the industry feeling that his style of both theater and filmmaking were passé, his financing evaporated, and he would wind up closing his production company altogether. In the last year of his life, Milligan disclosed his diagnosis to only 2 people, actor and rare close friend John Miranda and writer Jimmy McDonough, both of whom became his caregivers as his health failed. Andy Milligan died at the age of 62 with barely a penny to his name and was buried in an unmarked pauper's grave somewhere in Los Angeles. But his legacy would be preserved not only in seasoned fans of camp cinema discovering his work, but in recognition that his work includes some of the only film performances from New York actors who were the foundation of the Off-Off-Broadway movement, and in a biography penned by McDonough entitled The Ghastly One, a literary debut that earned praise from John Waters and launched the author's career, penning profiles of Milligan rival Russ Meyer, as well as Tammy Wynette, Al Green, and Neil Young.
The post is always late. I've told you that in my letters requesting money. I've told you that for the past 15 years.
15 years? Has it been that long? My, how time does fly.
Even among the so bad it's good movie crowd, Andy Milligan's work is considered an acquired taste. As some have put it, he was a filmmaker who steadfastly refused to learn from his previous experiences, preferring to continue working exactly the way he had all along. Handheld camera, fade-to-black scene transitions, and all. But you have to admit, it certainly worked for him. Until it suddenly didn't. Sound off in the comments below. Who's your favorite director and producer from the wild world of B-movies and exploitation? Are you a fan of the classics like fellow serious artiste Roger Corman? Or are you more of an 80s and 90s Lloyd Kaufman guy, also a guy who considers himself a serious artist? Or maybe you're a fan of Russ Meyer, the director who never met a D-cup he didn't like. Personally, I find myself in the Doris Wishman camp. Not just the most prolific female filmmaker, but the most prolific filmmaker of any gender in the entire history of cinema, and a major proponent of saving money on your costume budget by only filming in nudist colonies. While you're commenting, make sure you hit like and subscribe if you haven't already, and ring the bell so that you can get notifications whenever a new video is posted. I'll keep making them, you keep watching them. Until next time, watch like it means something.